Hello, welcome to Eyes Wide Open with me, your host, Lawrence Easman. We're on episode 51. It's been a bit of a slog to get here, but I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you for all your support so far. We're still exclusive on Rumble because I'm not going to upload to YouTube at least for another, 2 weeks once the second strike has come off. Today, it's just me. There's no guest. I'm developing a new style for the podcast where I'll do a monologue. I've always been interested in forbidden history, the things we're not taught about the key events that have happened in the past and how these events shape the modern world. If you want to understand politics and geopolitics, I think it really helps if we can get a deep understanding or deep insight of the events that led up to it, largely because these events are kind of scrubbed from history or at least hidden. It's all there. You've just got to put a bit of work into finding it and reading it, and it enlightens you. It enlightens me, and I enjoy doing that, and I want to share my findings with you. And as usual, part 1 is available free for all, and part 2 is for our burgeoning members who have joined on my website and are helping support the project to keep us going. You can get 7 days free as a member, and then it's a $5 a month. I think it's well worth it. In fact, it is well worth it. I hope you can join us. I hope you can help support the project. One of the biggest events in British history happening this weekend is the coronation of Charles III. I'm definitely going to be watching at least some of it just for the insight we can get into this ancient ritual of crowning a king. But the monarchy we have today is very different from the monarchies we've had in the past. And I want to look at a certain period today of English history in which we will look at the regicide of Charles I, the trial and execution of Charles I. Why was he killed? Who killed him? Why was the Bank of England something that came out of this transformation of the English monarchy? I think it's really important, especially in light of Charles III being crowned over the weekend. And then in part 2, we're going to look at the Opium Wars and how that is related to the growth of the British Empire on the back of the creation of the Bank of England. All really juicy, interesting stuff that I hope you can hang around for and give me your feedback and tell me what you think of what we're doing and where we're going with this. Because, we have Charles III's coronation this weekend. It's going to be a big day for the British and all of the other people watching around the world. We don't have monarchy anymore other than the British one. There's some minor European royals, but who the hell knows about them? The British have somehow maintained this pomp and circumstance and ceremony and all of this idea of anointing and crowning kings and making queens, and it seems a lot of people yearn for it and still love this whole ceremony. However, the monarchy in the UK is called a constitutional monarchy, which means the power is limited by the constitution. And after the Glorious Revolution, which was a revolution for the bankers, which we're going to talk about in the episode coming up, the king lost his primacy to be able to run the country. He became just a figurehead, and that's what we've seen as the monarchy over the last 70 years. Obviously, there's a lot of people out there that believe the monarchy still have immense power, and they run muted British Empire behind the scenes. I'm still not sure about that. I'm still not 100% sure about that. One thing for sure is it didn't seem like Queen Elizabeth II had much control or much power. She was the queen for 70 years, and I don't know anything that she stood for. Charles may be different because Charles has always been an outspoken Prince of Wales. He held the title of Prince of Wales longer than any other heir apparent in English history. And during that period, he was mouthy and he received a lot of criticism for his opinions. Is he going to be as an opinionated king? Is he going to look to have more political power than his mother had? If he does, it'll create a constitutional crisis. I'm always interested in constitutional crises because I want to know what's going on behind the scenes. So his coronation is going to be interesting. He's an old man. How long he's going to last is anyone's guess. It's not going to be a long reign, that's for sure. And therefore, will he use this short window as king of the British Empire to impose his will, to change the constitution, to give the monarchy more power? I don't know. I think that's something that we can discuss in today's episode and hopefully shine a little bit of light on that whole idea.
was 5 and he was 6. We rode on horses made of sticks. He wore black and I wore white. He would always win the fight. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down. Seasons came and changed the time. When I grew up I called him mine. He would always laugh and say, remember when we used to play? Bang, bang, I shot you down. Bang, bang, you hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, I used to shoot you down. Music played and people sang. Just for me the church bells rang. Now he's gone, I don't know why. And till this day sometimes I cry. He didn't even say goodbye. He didn't take the time to lie. Bang, bang, he shot me down. Bang, bang, I hit the ground. Bang, bang, that awful sound. Bang, bang, my baby shot me down.
Welcome back. The coronation of Charles III is fast approaching and is expected to be a once-in-a-lifetime spectacle beamed across the world as a demonstration of British tradition and culture, but also as a projection of British power. The British Empire is not dead yet, and Charles is going to make sure that that idea remains persistent in the minds of the population. That idea remains persistent in a global audience that may reach 1 billion people. He's even asked for people to swear allegiance to his reign. King Charles has waited most of his life for this event. In fact, he was the longest serving heir apparent in English history, and England has had some kings, which we'll get to in a short while. It's an unfortunate distinction that he has. When I see him or the royal family paraded to the public with the trappings of wealth that the royalty display, the gold carriage, the palaces, the adornment, the pageantry, the faces on the monetary supply, I often wonder, did the British monarchy actually have any power? Would they like more power? Or is the power that they project simply a front for the real power behind the throne, the financial powers that run the country from the City of London? Most likely, yes. That's what I want to look at today. Before he was crowned, it was presumed that Charles would take a regal name of George, King George, or even Arthur. His full name is Charles Edward George Arthur Windsor. Well, we know Windsor's not his real name. But anyway, so it was presumed that he would take a regal name other than Charles, because no one thought he'd keep the name Charles, as the connection to Charles I and Charles II is one of the most defining periods in British history and in the history of the monarchy. It represents a massive turning point in their power. So it's surprising that Charles would bring attention to it. That's what has brought my attention to this story today. In 1649, Charles I became the only English king in history to be tried and executed. He was found guilty by Parliament, by a parliament led by Oliver Cromwell, after he won the English Civil War against Charles in what can only be described as a kangaroo court. Charles's execution would be the catalyst for the devastating changes that we still feel the effects of today. We're going to get into those changes in a short while. King Charles III may not have a long reign. So I wonder with a name like Charles III if he will actually be an activist king during that reign. I know he's making lots of noises about moving the British monarchy away from its limited role as a constitutional monarchy, which means that the power of the monarchy is limited by the constitution. And Charles, making these noises, wants to move the monarchy back towards a more political role. The constitutional monarchy we find ourselves under today was largely established after his regal namesake was destroyed and executed. So is this what's triggering Charles? Is this what's triggering King Charles III? Well, let's have a little look into that today, shall we, and how the British monarchy was conquered by money power. According to Stephen Mitford Goodson's book, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, which is just an excellent book, Charles I was executed not for treason, as the history books tell us, but rather he was executed because he resisted the demands of the moneylenders who were based in Amsterdam at the time, because they wanted to establish a private central bank in England. But Charles said no. Goodson's book goes on to argue that Charles is not the only historical figure to be executed for opposing money power, but represents a long line of men who had the courage to resist. Now, we can usually spot these men because history vilifies them. As we know, the victors write the history, or at least the official public narrative, because if you look hard enough, you can find the truth is there for all to see. It's just buried and obfuscated, and they do their best to trash these men who have stood up. So the information I'm about to share with you may offend some people, and it's not my intention to offend anyone. I am merely sharing the information I find in Goodson's book and others like it. The Banking Swindle by Kerry Bolton is another great resource on this subject, or even Barren Metal by E. Michael Jones. I'm just interested in the truth, so I'm open to all sides of the story, and I'm not afraid to seek out those sources of information that are condemned by people who've got a vested interest in the truth. There's one thing I'm pretty damn sure of, though, is that the private banking practices that terrorize the world must be exposed and must be dismantled before this tiny cartel of slavers destroys the world. So let's have a look at how the events surrounding Charles's death led to the formation of a private money lending cartel, also known as the Bank of England, and how that became the model for all central banks around the world. Usury can simply be described as the charging of interest on money. That's a simple way of putting it, but it's a lot more complicated than that. Usury is a quaint name now hardly used, but it's the correct term, and it's the one we're going to use. Usury has been condemned by all religions throughout all ages, and by some of the greatest philosophers the world has ever seen. In Christianity, it was once a sin so serious that it was one of 4 sins that cry to heaven for vengeance. Usury is the destroyer of nations. And England has a long history in the struggle against moneylenders and those who use usury. But as our history is now taboo, we don't really talk about it anymore. Imagine how much power the moneylenders have, that talking about the history of moneylending is now forbidden. In England, kings have protected our nation against the perils of usury dating back to at least King Offa in the 8th century. Then Alfred the Great, who was the first to codify laws against usury in the 9th century. And finally to Edward the Confessor, who expelled the moneylenders in the 13th century. It's an important date in the calendar to understand what went on with Charles I's execution. Historically, the English were well aware of how destructive interest on money really is, and made some of the most protective laws anywhere in the world. English history dealing with this matter is unsurpassed. And it's a big problem for people who are trying to hide our history because they don't want us to know the truth. So your people are called racist for even looking at the facts of English history. In Goodson's book, he claims that the English kings had good reason to protect their nation from the perils of usury because it was usury that brought down the Roman Empire, which eventually collapsed under the burden that the moneylenders had placed it within. England had long periods where there was no usury practice on our islands, and great prosperity followed, unlike what we're told there's no progress without lending money. And this happened in the so-called Dark Ages. But usury is the mechanism of slavery, and slavery is the most profitable business on earth, and eventually those who practice this destructive power worm their way back into England. There are many historical reasons why that happened and how that happened, but according to Goodson's book, one of the most important events was in 1492 when Queen Isabella expelled the usurious moneylenders from Spain. They migrated to Holland, which was still under the Spanish Empire, and set up their money scam there. Significantly, and a major moment in history, they were able to persuade the Dutch authorities to grant a charter to legalize their fractional reserve lending scam, which is where banks lend out 10 times what they hold on reserve. So they create money from nothing and then charge interest on this fictional money, which compounds, making the borrower unable to pay and the lender obscenely rich. This blatant fraud has always been condemned and operated illegally and led to mass expulsions of those people who practiced it. However, the money lenders in Holland used this charter from the government to create a prototype central bank called the Whistle Bank in 1609. This action legitimized fractional reserve lending and compound interest for the first time in modern history. It was now legal robbery. As a result, that moneylenders were able to issue loans to the state. Amsterdam boomed and built an empire on the back of this fake credit, which sucked up the assets of the common people into the hands of the lenders, who then used it to fund more wars and more usury. The debtor is the slave to the creditor, and now, thanks to usury, the debtor can never settle his debts and therefore remains the slave of the creditor forever. As you can imagine, the rapacious greed of the moneylenders had only just begun. Their next target after Amsterdam was, of course, England. One, because they'd been expelled from our islands for the previous 300 years, and two, because as an island, they could create a usury fortress for the next phase of their diabolical plan. Again, according to the book A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, despite being expelled for 300 years, there was still an underground group of moneylenders running the fractional reserve usury scam from London, at least from the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. So after the success of the Amsterdam coup, they wanted to legitimize their English operation as well, of course. But there were still big obstacles to overcome. First, the anti-usury laws in England were still very much in place, and the DNA of the English people was encoded to resist it. But also, King Charles I opposed the idea of granting a private banking charter to moneylenders in Amsterdam, who were agitating constantly for him to grant one. Goodson claims in his book that a decision was made to remove Charles from the throne of England, and thus the resistance against the private bank. The English Civil War was fomented to achieve this goal. Goodson goes on to claim that Fernandez Carvalho, a merchant based in Holland, was one of the financiers of Oliver Cromwell and his new model army, which was used as the vehicle against Charles. Charles became aware of the growing threat of Cromwell's army and Parliament's growing power. In a preemptive strike, Charles stormed the Parliament, arresting 5 MPs loyal to Cromwell. And this event is regarded as the catalyst that triggered the war. It's an event so significant that it's still remembered today with the opening of the English Parliament and the Black Rod ceremony. Maybe it's something that we can do a show on in the future. So in 1642, Cromwell and Charles go head to head in the bloody English Civil War. If what Goodson and others say is true, Cromwell was the 17th century version of the Bolshevik Revolution, funded by foreign bankers to destroy a nation, our nation. Cromwell was the Trotsky of his day, and the Civil War saw 190,000 people dead, which was at the time 3.8% of the population. Another genocide against European people by bloody, greedy bankers. Cromwell won the war, took Charles prisoner, and became the first protector of England, a dictator of a new republic. Goodson shows letters between Cromwell and his Dutch financiers that claim he could not repay his debt by opening the doors of England while Charles was still alive. So Cromwell ordered the trial of King Charles I for treason and murder. The trial was a farce and led by the victors of the war. No English lawyer would draft a charge sheet against the king, so it was left to a Dutch lawyer to do it for them. For 3 days of the trial, the king demanded to know under what authority the court was operating, and that's one of the key things that we learn when we're discovering about our freedom and our sovereignty is, under what authority are you giving me these orders? Where does the authority flow? And the king was asking the same question. And in the same way that we don't get any legitimate answers, either did King Charles I. And no legitimate answers could be given as to where the authority was coming from to try the king. So in a desperate move to legitimize the trial, the judge held that the king was in contempt of court, so the trial could continue without him. In his absence, Charles I was found guilty of treason against the English people and sentenced to death. Hardly any of the parliamentarians dared sign the death warrant, and those that did so under the threat from Cromwell and his Bolshevik revolutionaries. So on the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I was beheaded in public, and all future monarchs now faced the same threat from Parliament if they stepped out of line. And if Goodson's book is to be believed, stepping out of line means stepping out of line of the money lenders. Until this point, it was the monarchy that held the sovereignty of the people. But after the Cromwell Dutch banker coup, Parliament now assumed total sovereignty. And it's been argued as to whether it's constitutional that Parliament holds the sovereignty of the people. Once this act of regicide was complete, Cromwell paid back his financiers and the moneylenders were once again back into England. But their one objective to legitimise their banking scam with a charter for a private bank still faced some resistance. And before we go any further into this riveting story, I love this story. I love finding out the true history of England and how we've got to where we are. Before we go any further, we're just going to take a quick break. So chill out, enjoy some music, get yourself a drink, and we'll be back soon. Welcome back as we take a tour through Money Power's revolutionary conquest of England. Before the break, we talked about how Cromwell led the revolution and killed the king. Well, Karma would get involved itself, and in 1655, before he could issue a charter for a new private bank, Oliver Cromwell died, just 6 years after the king. In the years following his death, he was such a hated figure that his body was exhumed at least 3 times in rage against his treachery and what he did to the English people. His son took over, but Cromwell's republic didn't last long, and Charles's son, in a weird twist of fate, became Charles II and is responsible for restoring the monarchy. Charles II, like his father, maintained the anti-usury laws that were enshrined in English law, despite some prototype central banking legislation being passed. In 1685, though, James II followed Charles II to the throne, and the slavers running the usury scam saw this as their opportunity to complete their bloody revolution. So by 1688, the private banking cartel based in Holland financed the campaign of Dutch Prince William of Orange to take the throne of England from James. James was defeated, and the usurers finally got their man on the throne of England. It was called the Glorious Revolution. Glory for them, not for the people of England, of course. William was installed without any resistance, and he agreed to be a constitutional monarch. Parliament now controlled the king, but more importantly, he repaid his finances, who now controlled Parliament, granting their long-coveted prize charter to form a private bank. And in 1694, the Bank of England was born. A private bank granted the right to issue money and lend it to the crown with interest. The moneylenders had finally conquered England and legalised a system of robbery that would bankrupt the nation. It was a catastrophic event in English and world history. The first act of the bank was to lend £1.2 million to William to finance his war against the French. This £1.2 million of credit was created from thin air, as the bank had acquired the right to issue the money without any gold as cover. They then, of course, charged the crown 8% per annum on the money they created out of thin air. Who had to pay back the interest? The people, of course, with our taxes. This initial loan to William created the national debt. For the first time in England's recorded history, we now had a national debt. A debt created out of thin air and loaded with interest, which is unpayable and designed to keep the nation in debt and under the control of the parasitic bankers forever. By 1720, just 20 odd years since its formation, the Bank of England claimed a national debt of £30 million. By 1783, it was £176 million. By 1815, it was £886 million. 1919, it was £7.4 billion. And now, in 2023, it's something like £2.5 trillion of money they've created out of thin air. It's the biggest scam going, but it's nothing more than a shell game you see at a fairground. And of course, one of the most profitable endeavours for these parasitic bankers is war. And they will fund all wars wherever they can, because the countries who engage in those wars increase their national debt tenfold, 20-fold, whatever. So while we have the Bank of England, we will never ever pay the national debt. It exists for that purpose. One of the primary concerns for the bankers was to lend William as much money as he would take in order to finance wars against other countries that were not yet under the usury banking cartel's system. France's Louis XIV was the first target, but not the only one. Anyone who resisted the moneylenders' desire to install another version of the Bank of England was targeted for conquest. And, like Charles I, wherever the central bankers faced resistance from national leaders, they would unleash their host nations in war against them, or worse, finance revolutions from within. This system is still in operation today, as brilliantly laid out in John Perkins's Confession of an Economic Hitman, a book I recommend to everyone. The objective of the slavers running the banking cartel is to have every country and every human under the control of the central banking enslavement system, and they won't stop until either they get their way or we get them. So the new king taking the regal name of Charles is no coincidence. The royal family will be acutely aware that their power was curtailed with the execution of Charles I and the advent of the Bank of England. We're told that the bank was nationalised in 1946 by a Labour government, but this is just more chicanery. If the bank was nationalised, then who the hell are we paying interest to? And why are we even paying interest if the bank belongs to the people? It's clearly nonsense, but it's another topic for another video on another day. Our taxes are enormous because we have been paying compound interest on a fake loan for the last 300 years. If King Charles really wants to make an impact during his short reign, he should do something truly historic and avenge the death of Charles I by abolishing the Bank of England and outlawing usury like the other great kings in English history. But unfortunately, I don't hold out much faith of that, and King Charles will most likely keep his mouth shut, extend the royal charter that gives the Bank of England its legitimacy, and keep his shares in the bank hidden, just like his mother did. Unfortunately, democracy ain't gonna save us, as Parliament is wholly owned by the bank. No, the only way to save England is for a true English king to emerge, rule by divine right, and crush the bank. I'd have no problem swearing an allegiance to such a king. Long live the true English kings. But all this talk of divine rights to rule and English kings of history and all of this patriotic talk has left me in a bit of a fluster. I need to go and get a drink, and I'll be back soon. Enjoy this music. Welcome back after that poignant video of Charles I's execution. Normally, I guess we're brought up to think that Charles deserved his execution and Cromwell was the good guy, when in fact it was Charles who stood up against the moneylenders and it was Cromwell who was paid by them. So we don't get to see that side of things, so I thought it might have been an interesting little evocative twist. I want to move on to the last segment now of this podcast, this new style of podcast that I'm going to be doing maybe once a month, twice a month, who knows. And in this last segment, I want to continue this idea of, we're talking about coronation, we're talking about the monarchy, but we're also talking about the degeneracy of the monarchy, how they've degenerated from being noble with the interests of England at heart to the partnership with the moneylenders and imposing this usury system upon the nation. So I think the last segment is going to be about the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars is another really fascinating period of history that we know very little about, but again has massive implications for geopolitical events that are happening now and over the last 20 years. I mean, what happened in Afghanistan? Why was the British and American military protecting the poppy fields? Well, if you look at the Opium Wars, you can chart a path back to history to understand why that happened and why we've got a fentanyl crisis in America right now. And I guess the drug problem that we have in England too, it's all rooted back to the origin story of the drug crisis, which takes us back to the Opium Wars. So we're just going to have one more short break before we come back in. Hang on for the final segment, we're almost there.
Just where I'm going, but I'm gonna try for the kingdom if I can, 'cause it makes me feel like I'm a man when I put a spike into my vein. And I tell you, things aren't quite the same when I'm rushing on my run, and I feel just like Jesus' son. And I guess that I just don't know, and I guess that I just don't know.
Hello, welcome back. In this final segment, we're going to look at how the establishment of the central banking cartel led to the international drug trade that plagues the world today. As we just discussed, England was conquered by money power in the late 17th century, called the Glorious Revolution, or the Glorious Bankers' Revolution. Now, this coup against England was capped with a royal charter for the Bank of England, which still gets renewed to this day. The last renewal was in 1998, I think. Some would say that this was actually the end of England as a sovereign state, because in 1707, the British Union was formed with the Acts of Union that led to the United Kingdom. So, with this new supranational state and the interest-based debt flowing from the Bank of England, the British Empire took off. And for the newly minted British Union, controlled by the bank from the City of London, one of the main sources of income was opium, the main ingredient of heroin. Now, according to Lyndon LaRoche's book, Dope Incorporated, the drug trade is still run and operated by the same money power running the empires back in the day. They use it as a great source of wealth, but also social control. And, of course, the opium trade led to opium wars. I read about the Opium Wars years ago, but I didn't look into them in any great depth until recently, and it's an Aladdin's cave of historical treasure, understanding of which can give real insight to what's happening in the world today, especially with drugs. In America right now, we see the fentanyl crisis, where Americans are hooked on synthetic opium, destroying hundreds of thousands of lives. The videos of American urban centers where the streets are littered with these zombified junkies is just a tragic sight to behold, and no one seems to care. The fentanyl crisis is largely run by one family, the Sacklers, who have become obscenely wealthy running this destructive narcotic monopoly. Obviously, the Sacklers wouldn't be able to get away with it without having their lackeys in the American government on backhanders allowing it to happen, and I'm sure money power is involved as well. But most importantly, or interestingly, the Chinese government is shipping in the ingredients which are produced in Mexico to create the fentanyl, and that then makes its way across the border. Some say this is China's revenge for the Opium Wars, but most likely it's just to make more money, increase their power, and weaken America as a direct rival. Although saying that, the Chinese regard the Opium War period as their century of humiliation, and the Chinese don't forget such things quickly. Now, you may be skeptical that one family like the Sacklers have the monopoly on fentanyl until you hear the opium story, because the parallels between the Chinese Opium Wars and the current American one are similar. For instance, one family like the Sacklers had the monopoly on the 19th century opium trade. They were called the Rothschilds of the East and became the richest dope dealers in the world, and eventually married into the Rothschilds, merging those unimaginable fortunes. The family in question, of course, are the Sassoons, who would go on to control large portions of China and the Far East, eventually becoming one of the founders of HSBC Bank, which was established to launder the incredible amounts of drug money from the opium trade. HSBC still runs this service today. Now, the amounts of money involved were so enormous, the Sassoons were able to cut in the British Empire and the burgeoning US Empire. In return, they provide their muscle against anyone who tried to stop their dope dealing operation. The story of the international drug trade begins with David Sassoon. Like his father before him, David was the treasurer for the Ottomans ruling Iraq at the time. But in a story we've heard a million times before, he had to flee Iraq in the dead of night because he was cooking the books. Of course he was. Sassoon fled to Bombay, where there was a small community of merchants who had already established themselves there. With his money-lending connections, it didn't take David long to get established himself, setting up David Sassoon Sons and Company. He had 8 sons and, like the Rothschilds, sent each of his sons to run a division of the company across the Far East. Sassoon would sell anything, and before long he discovered that the highly addictive drug opium produced in India was the perfect product for a happy merchant, so he began to ship opium from India to China. At the time, the opium trade was small and controlled by the British East India Company, who processed the opium in its factory at Gazipur, then shipped it down the Ganges to Calcutta, and it's here that Sassoon stepped in and became the middleman for the British East India Company. Now, the history of the BEIC is a story in and of itself. It was a chartered company, which means that it was incorporated by Royal Charter, like the Bank of England. Back then, chartered companies were like sovereign states. They were given monopoly rights and could go to form their own private armies. We're not going to cover chartered companies today, but they were an integral part of how money power conquered the world. So we're definitely going to revisit them in a future episode, but for now, let's get back to Sassoon. China had realized that opium was becoming a serious social and financial problem, so in 1800 they banned its production and importation. But smuggling was rife and Sassoon cornered the black market. By 1836, he was exporting 30,000 chests of opium, each chest containing 55 kilos. This was a tenfold increase and made the Sassoons fabulously rich and influential. The British, of course, got their cut, but Sassoon also brought in the East Coast American wasps, who were able to use the incredible income that the opium trade produced to build most of the East Coast of America. As an example, Warren Delano, the grandfather of President Roosevelt, built his fortune running opium for the Sassoons. John Kerry can thank opium for his privileged position too. But by 1839, the Sassoons' trafficking became so bad for the Chinese, it created an opium abuse epidemic, weakening the country and the military. The Chinese and their emperor made a decree to confiscate all of the opium they could get their hands on. This, of course, outraged Sassoon, who used his influence over the British to act as his enforcer. It's alleged that Rothschild, who had taken control of the British economy after his Battle of Waterloo coup in 1812, gave the order to the British government to assist Sassoon and crush the Chinese resistance to their population being doped out. The British complied and went to war against China, claiming as a pretext that innocent British civilians were being threatened by the Chinese. This is what became known as the Opium War. Now, despite being outnumbered, the British were able to use technological superiority to crush the Chinese and force an unconditional surrender. From this surrender, the infamous Nanking Treaty was formed. It was an unfair treaty in which the British negotiated to end the Canton system, which essentially gave Sassoon monopoly rights to sell opium to the Chinese without any hindrance by the Chinese government. Also, the Chinese had to pay an enormous sum of £21 million as reparations for destroying Sassoon's opium. And they had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British under a 99-year lease. Hong Kong was just a barren rock then, but obviously became an important British military base where they could monitor their Oriental interests. The entire treaty was a massive humiliation for the emperor and the Chinese. The opium business expanded to become the most profitable commodity in the British Empire. 1/5 of all opium was transported through Sassoon's fleet, and he became the emperor of the opium trade. But the situation for the Chinese became even worse as opium abuse continued to weaken the population. The Qing dynasty once again tried to fight back, but this time it was taking on not only the British but also the French Empire. They were crushed once again and forced into another humiliating treaty. This time they were forced to give away over 1.5 million square meters of land to Russia. They had to open up the interior of the country to the opium trade and were forced to legalize opium. Also, as a historical landmark, the Opium Wars represent the first time that Britain reached out to the US to form a military partnership to enforce its global interest in the drug trade. In 1864, the founder of the international drug business, David Sassoon, died, but not before he was able to see the opium trade explode to nearly 60,000 chests exported to China, doubling his previous output. His son took over the family company and within a year is one of the founding members of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, better known as HSBC. The bank was created as a clearinghouse to manage, distribute and invest the fortune made from the opium trade in China. It was literally established to launder the money from the drugs trade, a service it still offers today. Sassoon's son increased opium output to 100,000 chests and was making so much money the British Empire knighted him. To further entrench their position, one of the Sassoons married into the Rothschild banking dynasty. The Rothschilds, since at least 1812, control the Bank of England and the British Crown from their base in the City of London. The Rothschilds still set the price of gold each day. To this day, the Sassoons, after mixing with the British aristocracy, moved their headquarters to Britain to continue the international drug trade with the Rothschilds. Eventually, in 1907, the opium boom came to an end, as the British announced they would stop selling opium, publicly at least. A few years later, India announced that it will regulate opium crops, forcing opium production to move into the wilds of Afghanistan and Lebanon. The opium business was still a huge source of income, but had to go underground due to public outcry. The intelligence agencies stepped in to keep this money off the books and use it as a source of black ops slush funds. By 1949, the Chinese People's Republic emerged, and Chairman Mao, of all people, is credited with eradicating both consumption and production of opium amongst the Chinese. In a desperate attempt to cling on, the CIA took over Laos and used it as a base to grow opium and try and flood the Chinese market, but they're eventually kicked out by the Vietnamese. The international drug lords finally lost the Chinese market, but being the greedy, rapacious predators that they are, they needed new markets, and the West was becoming ripe. By 1979, the CIA and MI6 identified Afghanistan as a main location for opium and heroin production. So the Mujahideen and the Afghan warlords were sponsored to kick out the Soviet Union and take control of the poppy fields. Afghanistan became the main producer of opium and heroin in the world. But by 1996, the Taliban seized control and abolished opium production. With no source of opium production, the money-powered drug lords took action. And in 2002, the US and British Empire invaded Afghanistan and chased the Taliban out. Within a year, opium production resumed in new record quantities. The Helmand province, where most of the opium in Afghanistan is produced, was the region controlled by the British. Eventually, in 2020, the Taliban regained control of the country and the US and the UK finally left. But interestingly, rather than ban opium production like they did in 1996, the Taliban, since 2021, increased opium production by 32%. So the question is, were the Taliban able to retake Afghanistan without any resistance because they did a deal over opium production with the occupiers? Afghanistan supplies 80% of global opium and heroin demand. What do you think? So the same money power who conquered England and used their control of the banks to develop the drug business are still running the show today. Stories about Colombian drug lords are just movie narratives to keep the real kingpins hidden. Just look at the Sackler family, heirs to the Sassoon opium trade. No jail time for them. And now that the Chinese have blocked their own population from being destroyed by opium and other drugs, the real drug lords create a new market in the West to destroy our populations instead. And the banks continue to act as launderers for this drug money, especially the daddy of all launderers, HSBC, who in 2012 were fined $2 billion for their role in laundering money for Mexican and Colombian drug cartels, where most of the opium that hits America is now grown. So I think I've covered quite a lot in this episode today, and hopefully you like the way the new show is going to go. We've told a tale that shows the conquest of money power, not just from Holland, then England, but also China. We've even touched on France and the USA. We can go into more detail on those in the future episodes, but now I've just run out of time. But that's all I have time for today. Thanks for hanging around until the end. I'll speak to you soon.